This is a video record of our Baltic cruise on the Regal Princess from July 27th to August 7th, 2017. This is part 1. In this part we visit Copenhagen, Denmark, Oslo, Norway, and Berlin, Germany. For several years I had heard that a cruise around the Baltic Sea was one of the best cruises we could take. The Baltic Sea is that body of water that is north of Europe proper. There are many countries that border on the Baltic Sea, but this cruise only touched on 7. Those included Denmark, Germany, Estonia, Russia, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Now you might say, wait a minute, Norway does not have a border on the Baltic Sea, and you'd be right. Except we went to Oslo on the southern coast of Norway. I know that Oslo is not by the Baltic Sea either, but at least it's closer. Visiting those countries appealed to Robin and me, so in 2017 we decided to book a Baltic cruise. We looked at all the cruise lines, but only Princess offered a cruise that stopped in Oslo, Norway. That was a city I had always wanted to see, so I booked that cruise. The cruise would last for 12 days and would start and end in Copenhagen, Denmark. The cost of the cruise would be a little under $7,500 for both of us. The next thing to do was to book our flights. We had flown on Iceland Air before and liked it, but Iceland Air did not fly out of LAX. It did fly out of Boston, so I had to book 2 flights. A United flight to Boston and an Iceland Air flight to Copenhagen. Of course, the return flights would be the opposite. We arrived at the United terminal on the morning of July 23rd. Our plane left LAX at about 8 o'clock that morning, and after a 5-hour flight, we arrived in Boston. We spent the night in a hotel near the airport. The next day, July 24th, we returned to the airport. Because we had booked first-class seats on Iceland Air, and because Iceland Air had an agreement with Air France, we were able to use the Air France lounge before our flight. The flight left at 2:35 that afternoon. The seats and the service were fantastic. Like all Iceland Air flights, we made a stop in Reykjavik, Iceland, arriving there at about 1 o'clock in the morning of the 25th. After a short layover, we boarded another Iceland Air flight and continued on to Copenhagen, Denmark, arriving there at about 6 o'clock that same morning. I had prearranged through Princess to be met at the airport by a Princess representative. He would also drive us to our hotel in this bus. I had thought he would be picking up several other cruise passengers, but we were the only ones he met and drove to the hotel that day. Our hotel was the Scandic Copenhagen. We checked in by 7:30 that morning, and since nothing would be open at that hour, we decided to sleep for a couple of hours before going out sightseeing. After waking up, we discussed where we would go that day. We had visited Copenhagen in 2015, so we thought it might be fun to revisit some of the landmarks we had seen on that trip. We walked out of our hotel and were immediately reminded of how many bicycles there are in Copenhagen. The first site we visited was the statue of the Little Mermaid, which was inspired by the fairy tale of the same name written by Hans Christian Andersen. Next, we saw the Amalienborg Palace, the official residence of the Danish royal family. While we were there, we watched the changing of the guard ceremony. In the middle of the palace courtyard was this statue of King Frederick V. The statue is facing Frederick's Church, which is immediately behind the palace. Frederick's Church is also called the Marble Church because the inside is made mostly of marble. This is the inside of its dome. We next walked to St. Albans Church, a tiny but quite beautiful little edifice. We spent the first part of the afternoon visiting Rosenborg Castle and the Statens Art Museum. Later, on the way back to the hotel, we walked by this statue of Hans Christian Andersen, the most famous writer of children's fairy tales. His statue is looking at the entrance to the Tivoli Gardens, one of the world's first amusement parks. The statue is looking at Tivoli because Andersen and the gardens are very closely associated. In fact, this building is called the Hans Christian Andersen Castle. Almost from its very inception, the garden's programming and attractions were story-based, incorporating many of Andersen's fairy tales. Conversely, Tivoli Gardens had an impact on Andersen's fairy tales by helping to popularize them. In 1951, Walt Disney visited Tivoli Gardens and incorporated the idea of story-based attractions into the creation of Disneyland, substituting his characters for those of Andersen. After seeing the Andersen statue, we returned to our hotel. We had dinner, then we crashed. The next day, July 26th, we woke up early, had breakfast, and took off for our second and only full day in Copenhagen. In our 2015 trip there, we stayed in a hotel just down the street from this building. It is called the Round Tower, and it is Europe's oldest functioning observatory. The tower was built in 1642 and is 114 feet high. We never had time to go inside the tower on our 2015 trip, so I made a special point to climb to its top on this trip. I walked up this spiral ramp to access the top of the tower. I shot the following video from this location. The view from the top was truly amazing. Copenhagen is Denmark's capital and was originally a Viking fishing village. It was founded in the 11th century. About halfway up the street on the right is the hotel we stayed at on our first trip to Copenhagen in 2015. The name of the hotel was the St. Peter. After seeing the Round Tower, we had lunch at a little restaurant called Mormor's. This little restaurant was unique in that it was also a candy shop and a curio shop. After lunch, we walked to one of the canals of Copenhagen called Nyhavn. Nyhavn is one of the top nighttime entertainment districts in Copenhagen, but we were not there to soak up the entertainment. In our last visit to Copenhagen, we had missed taking a cruise around the Copenhagen canals from Nyhavn. This time we would take that cruise. The canal boats leave from and return to the head of the Nyhavn Canal. Hold on, I'll turn the view around 180 degrees and look back up the canal. We bought tickets for the cruise and boarded the flatboat with the blue seats. After everyone had boarded, our guide got on the boat. He introduced himself, then we cast off.
And for the safety, it's very important that you remain seated while we sail on the bridges, as the one in front of us right now. I'll let you know before it happens. It will happen many times today, but please also,
Each time the guide described something, he would say it in 3 languages. First English, then German, and then Italian. Here's an example of German.
Velkommen ombord, mine damer og herrer, på den her kanalrundfart rundt om København til København. SMS er jeres guide i dag på vores kaptajn.
Now Italian. Hans Christian Andersen used to live in this red brick building.
And now, please remain seated. Rimanete seduti. Grazie. Thank you.
The cruise went under many bridges. Some of the bridges had only a few inches of clearance between the passengers and the bottom of the bridge, which allowed us to touch the underside of those bridges. During the cruise, we got to see many of the sights of Copenhagen. For example, we got another view of Frederick's Church. We also saw the Copenhagen Opera House, which is much bigger than it looks from the outside because it has 8 levels below the part that is visible here.
14 stories, even though you can only see 9 of them. On your right side, you have the castle of Christiansborg, and that's where the Danish Parliament is and also Supreme Court. The building has burned 2 times. The first time was in 1791, and the second time was in 1881. And the building is 106 meters tall. The building on your right side with the green roof, that is the Danish Stock Exchange, built between 1620 and 1640. And the tower is especially intriguing since it's shaped by the tails of 3 dragons in twirling up to the top. And on the very top you'll see 3 crowns. And they symbolize Denmark, Norway and Sweden, the so-called Kalmar Union.
One of the most interesting looking landmarks we saw was the Royal Library, aka the Black Diamond. While we enjoyed seeing buildings and monuments, we enjoyed seeing everyday elements of Copenhagen life even more. After about 90 minutes, the tour was winding down as we approached the Nyhavn Canal once again. We got one more chance to touch the bottom of this bridge.
So now, yeah, the tour is coming to an end. And we want to thank you very much for sailing with us this late afternoon, and hope that you'll have a great time and a great evening here in Copenhagen. Thank you very much.
After we got off the boat, we both agreed that this cruise was the highlight of our time in Copenhagen. We next walked to this restaurant in the middle of downtown Copenhagen to have dinner. Right across the street from the restaurant was the Copenhagen City Hall. After dinner, we started walking back to our hotel. On the way, we passed by the Copenhagen train station. Once back in our hotel, we packed everything up in preparation for boarding the Regal Princess the following morning. After that, we crashed. The next morning, July 27th, we made our way to the Regal Princess to begin our Baltic cruise. The most striking features of the Regal Princess are the 2 curved walkways that jut out from each side of the ship. They are called sea walks. One is on the right side of the ship with an open gap at the top, and the other containing a bar is on the left side. On the floor of each seawalk there are glass windows that look down over the ocean. Each seawalk is 60 feet long, 128 feet above the ocean, and extends 28 feet beyond the edge of the ship. We were able to enter our cabin at about 1 o'clock that afternoon. It was one of the best cabins we have ever had. The bathroom was terrific and included a full-size bathtub. As an extra treat, we had pre-purchased a soft drink package that included bottled water. Just before departure time, we went out onto our balcony and saw this three-masted sailing ship cruise by. We also got a last look at the Copenhagen skyline. We left Copenhagen at about 5 o'clock that afternoon. We sailed overnight, and by the next morning, July 28th, we were just entering the fjord leading to the city of Oslo, Norway. After breakfast, we went out on our balcony and took in all the scenery as we cruised through the fjord. Luckily, the sun was shining and it was a beautiful morning. By 9 o'clock, we had finished our passage through the fjord and Oslo came into view. One of the first landmarks we saw was the Oslo City Hall, where the Nobel Peace Prize is awarded. Just to the right of the City Hall was the Akershus Fortress. Now hold on a second while I reverse the view. Okay, here again is the City Hall, and here is the Akershus Fortress. And this was the place we docked. It was just a few steps from many of the landmarks we had wanted to see. Our first destination was the Oslo Opera House. It was the furthest from the ship, so to save time we used a hop-on, hop-off tram to get there. We got off near the Opera House and immediately saw this oddity. It is a public sauna set on a platform which in turn is floating on the water. People who use the sauna can take a dip in the ocean after they use it. We didn't have time to take a sauna bath, so we proceeded to the Opera House. The Opera House was designed to look like an iceberg, right down to how the concrete in front of the opera goes down into the water. As you can see, people are allowed to walk all over the building, including on the roof. This was shot from the base of the Opera House. And here is the Opera House itself. This is the interior of the Opera House. You could see the top of the Regal Princess from the Opera House. From the Opera House, it is a short walk to the plaza in front of the train station. This is also the beginning of Oslo's main street, the pedestrian-only Karl Johan Street. Most of the best shops and restaurants are found along this street. One of the first buildings we saw was the old fire station. It is now the location of a restaurant and a few shops. We walked around the corner of the fire station and found a flower market. A little store next to the flower market had these gnome statues to attract buyers. We returned to Karl Johan Street and continued exploring. By now we were getting hungry, so we decided to have lunch. We thought for a few minutes about trying a restaurant serving local cuisine, but then we saw this McDonald's and thought, why not? Well, so much for the adventurous spirit. After lunch, we again returned to Karl Johan Street and continued our walk. About halfway up the street, we stopped at the Norwegian Parliament building. We then walked a couple of more blocks and reached this section of Karl Johan Street. On the left is the corner of a beautiful park. In this shot, you can just make out one of the most interesting fountains we have ever seen. The water forms a dome shape. I got the following clip at a different angle, but it still shows the action of the water. On the far edge of the park was the Oslo National Theatre. Returning to Karl Johan Street, we saw the University of Oslo. Looking the rest of the way up Karl Johan Street is the Royal Palace, which we visited next. While we were photographing the palace, this guy walked up and started making large, multi-shaped bubbles. The kids went wild. Just as we walked up to the palace, they started their changing of the guard ceremony. Quick observation. I have come to the conclusion that all European countries have such a ceremony. After the ceremony, we learned that they did not offer tours of the palace, so we walked around behind the palace to see the formal royal gardens. That is the palace in the background. After seeing the palace, we walked back down to the bottom of the hill and turned right. We continued on for a few minutes until we reached the City Hall. Here is what it looks like inside. As I said before, the Oslo City Hall is where they confer the Nobel Peace Prize. With that in mind, look at the man with the light blue shirt taking pictures. He is standing approximately where they bestow the prize. Here's a picture of President Obama accepting the prize in 2009 on that same spot. From the City Hall, we walked about a half a mile west to a dockside section of Oslo called Aker Brugge. By this time, Robin and I were getting tired, so we sat down on those steps. From that spot, we got a great view of our ship, the Regal Princess. Our cabin is on the side facing us. Say anything for posterity?
We're in Oslo and I am having the best time, and the weather is absolutely gorgeous. We hit on a wonderful day, and Norm's expert tour has been A+.
Aker Brugge is the primary home of many ferries that ply the waters around Oslo. It also contains many upscale shops and restaurants. We poked around some of the shops, and then we started walking back to the ship. We reboarded the ship and went straight up to the top deck to take some last-minute pictures. This again is the Akershus Fortress. It was ironic that we never got a chance to walk through the fortress, despite the fact that we were docked right next to it. We rested up and then had dinner. Later, we got the following pictures of the sunset over Oslo. It was about 10:30 when we finally pushed off from the dock and started making our way back through the Oslo fjord. The next day, July 29th, was an at-sea day. It was also a rest-up day for Robin and me, so we decided just to relax. We arrived the next morning, July 30th, at our next port of call, Warnemünde, Germany. Warnemünde was only a hop-off point, however. It happens to be the closest port to Berlin, Germany, which was our primary destination. We had purchased an excursion that would take us into Berlin, drop us off, and then pick us up later that day. We would be on our own to see the sights there. The excursion included a train ride from the ship to Berlin and back. We had breakfast, then we boarded the train that took us the 150 miles to Berlin. We arrived there at about 10 o'clock. We were then taken to a waiting bus, which dropped us off at the Berlin Hilton, our starting and ending point. Across the street from the Hilton were 3 historic buildings in a row: the new church, the concert house, and the French church. Because of time constraints, we only took a few pictures and moved on. We next walked to the Bebelplatz. In 1933, this was the site of the famous Nazi book-burning mob scene. To ensure people will never forget the insanity of that night, Berlin built this memorial showing empty bookshelves. Across the street from the Bebelplatz, you can see part of Humboldt University. Among the famous faculty of that university was Albert Einstein, and among the famous alumni was Karl Marx. Turning right at the university and walking a short distance, we came to the Berliner Dome, aka the Berlin Church. A few blocks to the east is the Berliner Observation and Television Tower, built during the Cold War by the Russian government. Just after the tower was built, people started noticing a naturally occurring phenomenon on the ball of the tower. Can you see it? This picture may help. Sunlight striking the glass on the ball always formed a cross. This was hugely offensive and embarrassing to the Russians, as they had always rejected religion, but it delighted Germans on both sides of the Berlin Wall. Unfortunately, we never got to visit the tower. Back to the Berliner Dome. You may notice that the building looks very black from soot. That was the result of the bombing of Berlin during the war. In that regard, the dome was quite fortunate in that it suffered relatively little damage during the war. The inside of the dome was unforgettable. The organ was the most ornate I had ever seen. After seeing the Berliner Dome, we set out for our next destination, the Reichstag building, which is the seat of the German government. We were going there because I had purchased tickets to go inside the Reichstag. The tickets were for 1:30 and it was now 1:20. This meant that we had to walk over a mile in 10 minutes in the heat. After much effort and cursing, we finally arrived at the Reichstag exactly at 1:30. Like the dome, the Reichstag had been heavily damaged during the war. The element that took the most damage was the dome, and that was where we were going with our tickets. Here is the dome as we saw it. Inside the dome is this glass cone covered with hundreds of mirrors. The highlight of seeing the dome was to make it to the top, but to do that we had to hike up this spiral ramp. Not an easy task after making that forced march to get here. After we huffed and puffed up the ramp, we realized there was no air conditioning there, and the sun was beating through the glass ceiling, making it hotter inside than it was outside. But despite all that, Robin was a real trooper and never lost her composure. This guard kept giving Robin and me the evil eye, but we never figured out why. In this clip, I'm panning down that mirrored cone you saw earlier. At the bottom of it is a glass ceiling under which the members of the German parliament meet. After we finished our tour of the Reichstag, we made our way over to the Brandenburg Gate. We crossed the street, walked through the gate, and turned around to get the following clip. A couple of blocks south of the Brandenburg Gate was the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. The memorial consists of two parts. The first, at ground level, are these unmarked concrete blocks. People can walk through the blocks and contemplate as they wish. Below ground is a museum of the Holocaust. A couple of blocks east of the memorial is this vacant lot. Beneath it are the remains of Hitler's bunker, where he ran the war and where he committed suicide in May of 1945. As we were walking to our next landmark, I spotted this little marvel of engineering. I told Robin to shoot a picture of it. It is a Trabant, the East German answer to General Motors. Nicknamed a Trabi, it is rated by every car expert in the world as the worst car to ever be manufactured by anyone, anywhere, anytime. For over 30 years, the Trabant was an object of ridicule by West Germans. After the reunification of Germany, a Berlin businessman opened a rent-a-Trabi agency. People rent his Trabis as a lark. He called the agency Trabi World. The next landmark we visited was one of the two remaining guard towers in Berlin. The East Germans built many of these towers and used them in conjunction with the Berlin Wall that they built in the early 1960s. The Berlin Wall was really two walls, an inner wall and an outer wall, with an open space in the middle. The East Germans placed these guard towers every quarter mile in that middle span. Each tower housed two armed guards 24/7. The guards in the towers were there to shoot people trying to cross from East into West Berlin. We walked further east of the tower until we got to the last of two segments of the Berlin Wall still standing. The top of the wall was curved to make it harder to throw a grappling hook over to climb the wall. The Russians thought of everything. Just opposite the wall was a museum called the Topography of Terror, which was built on the site of the former Gestapo headquarters. The museum documents the horrors of Nazism. The last place we visited was called Checkpoint Charlie. This was the best-known Berlin Wall crossing point between East Berlin and West Berlin during the Cold War. We arrived back at the Berlin Hilton a little bit early, so we had time to go shopping in this little store. The store sells merchandise related to this little character. He is called Ampelman. The character was used in traffic signals in East Berlin during the Cold War. After the reunification of Germany, the new Berlin City Council wanted to erase all symbols of the old East German government, including the Ampelmann. But the citizens of Berlin wanted to keep the Ampelmann, so they did. After we shopped, we got on the bus that took us back to the train station. From there, we began our trek back to the ship. During the trip, we noticed that we had walked over 10 miles around Berlin that day. Robin really felt the effects of all that walking. She may be smiling, but she has her feet elevated because her feet and ankles were swollen. When we arrived back at the ship, the sun was just setting. That cast a pink light on the side of the ship that was really striking. That night we were both exhausted. We fell asleep quickly and stayed asleep. The next day, July 31st, was an at-sea day. It was also Robin's birthday. While she tried to rest all day, Robin's feet and ankles were still swollen from all the walking we did in Berlin the day before. Because of that, Robin decided to go see the ship's doctor. He gave her some medications and told her to stay off her feet all day. While Robin relaxed in a deck chair listening to music on her iPhone, I did more exploring of the ship, starting with the sea walks. You can get a better picture of the right-hand sea walk by looking down through its opening. Behind the right-hand sea walk there are cabins with balconies. Passengers who stay in those cabins have the least amount of privacy on the ship. The rest of the day was nice and easy. I loved getting a Diet Coke with unlimited refills and just watch the goings-on around the pools. This is the adults-only pool. Along both sides of that pool are for-rent cabanas for a small, wink wink, daily fee. To celebrate Robin's birthday, we had made a reservation to have dinner at the Crown Grill, the pay extra for specialty restaurant. Before we arrived at the restaurant, we stopped at one of the ship's bars and had a celebration drink. The dinner that night was excellent. The sunset that night was just average, but even an average sunset over the ocean is still pretty.